Somewhere in every manipulator's playbook, there's an unspoken assumption they never think to question because it's worked so reliably, so consistently on nearly everyone they've ever encountered. The assumption is simple: if you press hard enough, in the right place, something will show. Anger, tears, panic, guilt. Some visible crack in the composure that tells them exactly where the pressure point lives, exactly how much force it takes to produce a reaction, exactly what lever to pull the next time they need this person to bend. This assumption isn't even conscious most of the time. It's instinctive, built from a lifetime of testing people and watching them respond exactly the way manipulation is designed to make people respond. And then, every so often, a manipulator encounters someone who breaks the assumption entirely, someone who absorbs the pressure and simply doesn't crack, someone whose face stays level, whose voice stays even, whose eyes hold a kind of quiet, unreadable steadiness that gives absolutely nothing away, no matter how precisely the provocation was aimed. And in that moment, something shifts for the manipulator that they rarely have language for, because it contradicts everything their entire strategy has ever depended on. If you've ever been told you're hard to read, if you've noticed that certain difficult, manipulative people seem to grow quieter, more cautious, almost uncertain around you compared to how they behave with everyone else, you've likely already become exactly the kind of person we're talking about today: a non-reactive empath. And understanding exactly why this quality makes you so profoundly difficult to manipulate is going to change how you see every difficult interaction you've ever had. Let's start with the foundational truth that explains almost everything else in this conversation. Manipulation isn't actually about controlling what you do. It's about controlling what you feel, because feeling is what ultimately drives behavior. A manipulator doesn't need to force you into any particular action directly. He simply needs to produce the right emotional state: guilt, fear, desperate desire for approval, anxious uncertainty, and then wait patiently for that emotional state to push you toward the behavior he actually wants. This is why manipulation tactics so consistently target emotion rather than logic. A purely logical argument can be countered with a better logical argument. But an emotional state, once successfully triggered, tends to override logic almost completely, at least in the moment it's actively being experienced. This is precisely why gaslighting works, why guilt tripping works, why manufactured crises work so reliably on so many people, because they bypass rational evaluation entirely and go straight for the nervous system's emotional response, which is much harder to consciously override once it's already been activated. Most people, especially those who haven't done significant emotional work, have relatively transparent access points for this kind of manipulation. Their emotional reactions happen quickly, visibly, and predictably enough that a skilled manipulator can map them within just a few interactions. This person responds to guilt. That person responds to fear of abandonment. This other person can be moved through flattery, followed by sudden withdrawal. Once mapped, these access points become reliable tools, used again and again throughout the relationship, refined over time into increasingly precise instruments of control. A non-reactive empath disrupts this entire system in a way that goes far deeper than simple emotional suppression. And this distinction matters enormously because it's the key to understanding why this particular quality is so uniquely powerful against manipulation specifically. Here's what's crucial to understand. A non-reactive empath isn't someone who has stopped feeling things deeply. If anything, she often feels things more deeply than the people around her, precisely because her empathic nature means she processes emotional information with unusual intensity and nuance. What's different isn't the depth of her feeling, it's the relationship between her feeling and her external expression of it. For most people, especially those without significant emotional regulation practice, feeling and expression happen almost simultaneously. The emotion arises, and within moments, it's visible on the face, audible in the voice, present in body language that broadcasts the internal state to anyone paying attention. This immediacy is what manipulators rely on to read and exploit emotional responses in real time. A non-reactive empath has developed, usually through significant effort and often through painful necessity, a gap between feeling and expression. She still feels the emotion fully, sometimes even more intensely than the average person given her heightened emotional sensitivity. But she's developed the capacity to hold that feeling internally, to process it privately, to choose deliberately whether, when, and how much of it gets externally expressed, rather than allowing it to broadcast automatically the moment it arises. This gap, this space between feeling and expression, is precisely what makes her so difficult to manipulate, because it removes the real-time feedback loop a manipulator depends on to calibrate and refine his tactics. He can no longer watch her face and know immediately whether his words landed. He can no longer read her body language for confirmation that a particular manipulation tactic is working. He's essentially operating blind, testing tactics that used to produce reliable, visible confirmation, and receiving instead a calm, steady silence that tells him nothing. This blindness is more destabilizing to a manipulator than almost anything else he can encounter, because his entire operational method depends on real-time feedback. Think about how manipulation actually functions moment to moment in a normal interaction. A manipulator says something calculated to produce guilt, watches for the flicker of discomfort crossing your face, and adjusts his next sentence based on what he sees. He tests a boundary gently at first, watches whether you flinch, hesitate, or immediately comply, and calibrates how hard he can push based on that immediate response. This is not some elaborate, consciously plotted strategy in most cases. It's closer to a predator's instinct, refined through years of practice, reading micro signals most people don't even realize they're broadcasting. A non-reactive empath removes the entire feedback mechanism this instinct depends on. And here's what's fascinating about what happens next, psychologically, inside the manipulator himself, because it reveals something crucial about how fragile manipulation actually is once its primary tool gets taken away. Without visible confirmation that his tactics are working, a manipulator doesn't simply shrug and move on to logic-based persuasion instead. He escalates almost every single time because escalation is the only strategy his toolkit actually contains for situations where the usual signals aren't appearing. This escalation is worth understanding in detail because it explains a pattern that confuses a lot of non-reactive empaths when they first develop this capacity. The sense that difficult people seem to try harder, push further, become more intense in their tactics, rather than simply giving up once the usual approach fails. This isn't because non-reactivity doesn't work. It's actually evidence that it's working exactly as intended, disrupting the manipulator's calibration so completely that his only available response is to apply more pressure, hoping that eventually, somewhere, a crack will finally appear. But here's what a non-reactive empath understands, often through hard-won experience, that keeps her steady through this escalation phase rather than eventually breaking under the increased pressure the way the manipulator is counting on. Escalation itself is information. It tells her, with increasing clarity, exactly how much this person depends on producing a visible reaction in order to feel a sense of control. The harder someone pushes when their usual tactics aren't working, the more clearly it reveals that control, not connection, was always the actual goal of the interaction. This understanding changes everything about how she experiences the escalation. Instead of feeling worn down by increased pressure, she often feels something closer to confirmation, proof that her steadiness is genuinely disrupting something the manipulator relies on, proof that the strategy of non-reactivity isn't simply failing to work, but is actually functioning exactly as intended, forcing an increasingly desperate manipulator to reveal the true mechanics of his approach through sheer escalating intensity. There's a second, equally important reason non-reactive empaths become so difficult to manipulate, one that goes beyond simply disrupting the feedback loop manipulators depend on. It has to do with something we might call narrative resistance, the capacity to hold on to your own internal understanding of events, even while someone actively, persistently, tries to convince you of a different version. This matters enormously because manipulation, especially the kind practiced by narcissists and other psychologically sophisticated manipulators, rarely relies purely on emotional pressure alone. It almost always involves narrative construction, a carefully built alternative account of reality designed to make you question your own perception, your own memory, your own basic understanding of what actually happened in a given interaction or relationship. This is the mechanism behind gaslighting specifically, and it depends heavily on your emotional reactivity to succeed. Here's why. When a manipulator begins constructing an alternative narrative, insisting an event happened differently than you remember, claiming you're overreacting to something that was clearly intentional, reframing their cruelty as your oversensitivity. The emotional destabilization this produces in a typical target actually assists the manipulation. Confusion, self-doubt, anxious uncertainty about your own perception all make you more susceptible to accepting the manipulator's version, simply because your own internal compass has been sufficiently disrupted to make trusting it feel unreliable. A non-reactive empath experiences this attempt differently precisely because her emotional steadiness extends into cognitive steadiness as well. Because she's not being emotionally destabilized in real time, she retains far greater access to her own memory, her own perception, her own internal sense of what actually happened, even while someone is actively trying to convince her otherwise. This doesn't mean she's immune to all forms of gaslighting, or that narrative manipulation never affects her at all, but it means the emotional flooding that typically accompanies successful gaslighting simply doesn't occur with the same intensity, which means her capacity for critical evaluation of the competing narrative remains largely intact throughout the attempt. This combination, disrupted feedback loops and preserved narrative resistance, creates something a manipulator has almost no effective countermeasure for, because his entire strategic toolkit was built for a different kind of target entirely. He was trained, through years of successful practice on people who react quickly and visibly, to work with immediate emotional feedback and gradual narrative erosion. A non-reactive empath offers him neither. She's not confirming his tactics are landing, and she's not losing access to her own perception the way his usual targets eventually do. This is precisely why manipulators so often describe non-reactive empaths, even without fully understanding why, as somehow different, difficult, hard to get through to, language that reveals genuine confusion about why someone who should theoretically be just as manipulable as anyone else simply isn't responding according to the predictable patterns they've relied on throughout their entire history of successfully manipulating other people. There's something worth addressing directly here, because it's a common misconception that deserves clarification before we go further. Non-reactivity isn't the same thing as suppression, and it isn't a strategy built on denial or avoidance of genuine emotional experience. This distinction matters enormously because unhealthy suppression, pretending feelings don't exist, disconnecting from your own emotional reality entirely, actually makes someone more vulnerable to manipulation over time, not less. Because emotions that are denied rather than processed tend to leak out in unpredictable, poorly regulated ways that manipulators can still exploit, just through different, messier channels. What we're actually describing is something closer to emotional sovereignty, full, complete access to your own feelings, combined with genuine choice about when, where, and with whom those feelings get externally expressed. This is a far more sophisticated psychological achievement than simple suppression, because it requires an empath to develop real emotional regulation skills, real capacity for internal processing, real ability to sit with intense feeling without either denying it or immediately broadcasting it to whoever happens to be present in the moment it arises. This is often built painfully through exactly the kind of experience we've discussed in previous conversations. Surviving relationships where visible reactivity was consistently punished, exploited, or weaponized until the nervous system gradually adapted, developing this protective gap between feeling and expression as a genuine survival mechanism rather than a conscious strategic choice made in a vacuum. Understanding this origin matters because it explains why this capacity, once developed, tends to persist long after the specific relationship that necessitated it has ended, becoming a permanent feature of how this particular empath moves through every future interaction with manipulators and non-manipulators alike. And this is where something crucial begins to emerge about what non-reactivity actually costs, and more importantly, what it ultimately protects. Once we look closely at exactly how this quality functions, not just during active manipulation attempts, but across an entire lifetime of relationships, this empath will go on to build once she's fully developed this rare, hard-won capacity. Because here's what deserves honest examination before we finish this conversation. Non-reactivity, powerful as it is against manipulation, carries a real cost that's worth naming clearly, rather than presenting this quality as some purely triumphant achievement without complexity or trade-off attached to it. The same gap between feeling and expression that makes a non-reactive empath so difficult to manipulate can also, if left unexamined, create genuine distance in relationships that actually deserve her full, visible emotional presence. This is one of the most important nuances to understand about this entire capacity, because without this understanding, non-reactivity risks becoming another form of self-abandonment, simply disguised as strength rather than recognized as the protective adaptation it actually is. Here's the crucial distinction that separates healthy non-reactivity from its unhealthy shadow version. Healthy non-reactivity is selective. It's a skill deployed deliberately in situations that genuinely call for protection, rather than a blanket default applied indiscriminately to every relationship, regardless of whether that relationship has actually earned or deserves her full guardedness. A non-reactive empath who has done real integration work learns to recognize the difference between a manipulator actively testing her boundaries and a genuinely safe person simply trying to connect with her authentically. The former warrants the protective gap we've spent this entire conversation describing. The latter deserves something different entirely: genuine, visible, unguarded emotional presence, offered specifically because that person has demonstrated, through consistent, trustworthy behavior over time, that they've actually earned access to it. This selectivity is what separates a fully healed, sophisticated, non-reactive empath from someone who has simply become permanently guarded as an unprocessed trauma response, unable to distinguish between contexts that call for protection and contexts that call for openness. The unhealthy version applies the same flat, unreadable calm to everyone, indiscriminately, regardless of whether they're a manipulator actively testing for weakness or a loving partner simply trying to understand what she's feeling in a given moment. This version, while still offering some protection against manipulation, ultimately isolates her from the very connection and intimacy she's capable of building with people who genuinely deserve access to her full emotional world. The healthy version, by contrast, requires ongoing discernment, a continuous, conscious evaluation of who has earned visible vulnerability and who hasn't, rather than a permanent, unconscious shutdown applied universally regardless of context. This is genuinely difficult work, requiring far more sophistication than simply staying calm under pressure. It requires her to actively practice softening, actively practice visible emotional expression, actively practice trusting people enough to let them see what's happening inside her, specifically in relationships where that trust has been consistently, demonstrably earned. This is why the healthiest version of this capacity isn't really about becoming permanently unreadable to everyone. It's about developing the ability to choose, consciously and deliberately, exactly who gets to read her and who doesn't, reserving the protective non-reactivity specifically for situations and people who have demonstrated they cannot be trusted with genuine vulnerability, while actively cultivating the opposite quality, full, transparent emotional presence with people who have proven through sustained trustworthy behavior that they deserve it. Understanding this distinction matters enormously for anyone recognizing themselves in this description because it prevents an important mistake: the assumption that becoming harder to manipulate requires becoming harder to know entirely, permanently, in every context, with everyone. That assumption, if left unexamined, risks costing her exactly the kind of deep, authentic intimacy she actually wants and deserves, with people who were never the ones this protective adaptation was ever designed to guard against in the first place. There's something else worth understanding about the deeper psychological function this capacity serves, something that extends beyond simple protection against manipulation into territory that touches her fundamental relationship with her own sense of safety in the world. Because non-reactivity, once fully developed and properly calibrated, doesn't just protect her from external manipulation, it also protects something internal: her own capacity to trust her own perception, her own emotional responses, her own understanding of what's actually happening in any given interaction, without that trust being constantly disrupted by other people's attempts to convince her otherwise. This internal protection matters just as much as the external protection against manipulation, because so much of what makes empaths vulnerable to sustained exploitation isn't simply their visible emotional reactivity. It's the way that reactivity, once triggered and exploited repeatedly, gradually erodes their confidence in their own perception, teaching them, through painful repetition, that their instincts cannot be trusted, that their reactions are somehow always excessive or inappropriate, that the safest strategy is simply to doubt themselves rather than trust what they're actually sensing about a situation or person. A non-reactive empath, precisely because she's maintained this protective gap between feeling and expression, retains something crucial that gets progressively eroded in empaths who remain highly reactive within exploitative relationships: unbroken confidence in her own internal compass. She knows what she felt, what she perceived, what actually happened, because that knowledge was never disrupted by the emotional flooding that typically accompanies successful gaslighting and narrative manipulation. This preserved self-trust becomes, over time, one of the most valuable psychological resources she carries into every future relationship, professional interaction, and difficult situation she'll ever encounter. This is ultimately why non-reactive empaths become so profoundly difficult to manipulate, not through any single mechanism alone, but through the combination of everything we've discussed throughout this entire conversation: disrupted feedback loops that leave manipulators operating blind, preserved narrative resistance that prevents successful gaslighting, and unbroken self-trust that no longer requires external validation to feel confident and secure. Together, these create something close to psychological sovereignty, a state where her sense of reality, her emotional safety, and her fundamental confidence in her own perception no longer depend on anyone else's cooperation, understanding, or validation in order to remain stable and intact. If you recognize this quality in yourself, if you've noticed manipulative people growing quieter, more cautious, less confident in their usual tactics whenever you're present, while genuinely safe people still get to see the full depth of what you actually feel, understand exactly what you've built. This wasn't given to you easily, and it likely cost you real pain to develop. But what you're carrying now is something genuinely rare, genuinely powerful, and genuinely, permanently yours. You are no longer an open book that anyone can pick up and read according to their own convenience. You have become someone who decides deliberately and wisely exactly who earns access to your pages. And that decision, more than any single tactic or strategy, is exactly what makes you impossible to manipulate the way you once were. About what's actually happening inside her.